we always on this podcast have bemoaned that like most people are under applying sunscreen. More is more, more is more. But apparently, when things are really cheap, people apply to 200% of the recommended amount.
Yeah.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the Chemist Confessions podcast. I'm Gloria.
I'm Victoria.
And this is a human conversation on all the skincare science we talk about on the daily. And today is kind of a special episode because it is a little bit about the science, but a lot about the drama.
Long story short, we are getting ready for our annual 30 for 30 sunscreen challenge. And with that comes, we should probably be doing a sunscreen update because their sunscreens have been in the news as of recently.
Yes.
So we should talk about essentially the drama. We'll touch a little bit on tariffs, but we will also share some interesting science just leading up to the season of a lot more sun. So with that, in this first segment, we are going to address some of the drama that is centered around some of the Asian sunscreens being sold in the US.
Yes. So we have talked about this on this podcast a lot. And if you've gone down the rabbit hole looking for that sunscreen that you're finally willing to put on your face, you'll know that the US uses a much smaller set of sunscreen filters than pretty much the rest of the world. And because of that, places like Europe, Asia, Australia tend to have nicer textures than US-based sunscreens. So in recent years, these foreign-made sunscreen have become very, very popular in the US. So you can buy it on specialty shops that specialty online retailers like YesStyle, Stylevana, where they will buy in Asia and ship directly to you. And you can use like Amazon, and you'll notice that, I can get these via Prime. And that's because in recent years, some of these sunscreen have become so popular that they have straight up imported these sunscreen into the US, and that's led to a few problems.
So with that, the FDA, I think probably since last year, really felt like the year of cracking down on things. We actually showcased how Biore and the beloved Aqua Rich sunscreen that we love to recommend so much, they ended up coming out with a US version to say, oh, but we have our US version. So, there's that main channel, The sad part was the US formula just wasn't as well received because, yes, in fact, if you still use the archaic sunscreen filters that are approved for the US, the finish is just not as clean. It's more greasy. There's more drag. But surprisingly, I think Gloria and I, for that formula, we were happy that it still retained that fresh break that is very characteristic of the formula. So that, I feel like, is where it kind of starts. And then in the beginning of this year, there was a lot of drama on social talking about how Beauty of Joseon no longer sells their sunscreen on their website.
Right.
You can still purchase their sunscreens through YesStyle and Stylevana, some of these backdoor channels, but they had taken that down and it did cause a lot of concern for people who very much love this sunscreen formula. And then finally, we should mention that one of our favorite sunscreens that we liked from our very first 30 for 30 series, Neogen's Airy sunscreen, had received a warning letter from the FDA. And that was pretty much the beginning of last fall. And so, yeah, we should talk about what exactly is going on and why this is happening.
Yeah, so this gets into a little bit of the regulation side of the cosmetic world. We don't talk about a lot, but it is very important. On the cosmetic side, so your day-to-day moisturizer, cleansers, those are regular cosmetics. There are certain manufacturing guidelines that should be in place and manufacturers adhere by. And then you have the OTC side of things that in the consumer's mind sometimes lump these together. So these are your acne products and your sunscreens. OTC ingredients, the one with the little drug fact label, is considered a drug. These should be produced under much more strict guidelines under the OTC rules. And that includes anything from, honestly, it's a lot of paperwork. So from the ingredients, every ingredient that goes into it, where does it come from? What lot number is it? When does it expire? To the manufacturing practice. When was it produced? How are you testing for efficacy? And how are you checking on the stability of this product? All of it has guidelines under the FDA rule. And more importantly, where they produce these things need to be under a facility that's been approved by the FDA that can produce under these very stringent guidelines. But of course, with these foreign sunscreens, sometimes these manufacturing facilities haven't actually gone through the FDA registration process.
And you have to keep in mind that this is US-based regulation. So of course, with Asia-based brands, regulations are going to be different per region. And so that's where some of this discrepancy happens. And of course, when the FDA, Gloria and I, we talk about how this is kind of those classic scenarios in the industry of when regulation comes in is usually when, you become a very big fish. So with the volume of imported sunscreens, it kind of only felt like a matter of time before the FDA has started to really look into some of these sunscreens and their ability to sell.
So what does that mean with all the drama? I think the number one questions we get around this is, wait, hold on. Does that mean the sunscreen I got is not legit? Like, is it not really providing that efficacy? We would say that we wouldn't stress too much about. All the international sunscreens, even though they're under different guidelines, they have their own guidelines, and SPF testing, generally speaking, is
Pretty
the
similar,
same, pretty
yeah.
similar across different protocols.
UVA is where it's different.
Yes, UVA is where it's different and arguably more stringent outside of the US than within the US. So we wouldn't worry too much about that. This might mean that it will be harder going forward to find legitimate Asian-based or even European-based products because of these channels getting shut down. And another channel that hasn't been playing, strictly speaking, by the rules is Amazon. Sunscreens you buy on Amazon, not 100% sure right now. And this is all complicated by the tariff situation.
Yeah, so just a brief note on tariffs. To add to the sunscreen purchasing limitations that are going to be in place, we can confirm that beauty is going to be impacted by, well, the ever-evolving tariff situation. We can definitely confirm, being brands ourselves, that costs will increase from both the packaging and the material side of things. We definitely want to share that beauty is very much an international collaborative effort to create a product, because materials are oftentimes researched and produced like from labs across the globe. Yeah. And that is the nature of our industry. So Gloria and I do anticipate for goods to go up. And I will share that in terms of cost of Asian sunscreens, I actually found my old receipt of when we purchased our Beauty of Joseon for our 30 for 30 sunscreen. And I'll share that here in 2023. You can see I purchased it for $12.69. Pretty sure I bought it at a discount, so I'm going to assume that was probably around the $15 amount. And in 2025, Beauty of Joseon now retails at $18, and I believe currently with a $14.40. That's with a discount. With the cost of inflation and then add to the tariff, we don't really know where the price point, I guess, that ceiling will be in the next couple of years. However, I think why Gloria and I are not necessarily concerned by these prices or the increase in price is because they're still significantly cheaper than drugstore sunscreens made in the US and sold in drugstores. So
we have noticed that drugstore sunscreen pricing in the US in general has been increasing quite a bit every year. And that's another one that we're keeping tabs on for our 30/30 this year, is we're trying to do a spread across different price points to see, for those people who are looking for just a budget, like I'll slather every sunscreen versus a little treat yourself to your face. But we find that when we do that and we go into the drugstores, we're like, wait, a tub of banana boat is how much now? So it's definitely there's definitely some pain points there. So we're going to keep an eye out on the situation and keep everyone posted.
So to sum up, what does all this mean? We can definitely say as of now, I probably would say that the sunscreen realm is actually pretty much the same. The Asian sunscreens that we love are all still available through YesStyle and Stylevana. The mode of purchasing through these channels, backdoor channels, always comes with a tiny amount of risk. Just because when you add another step into the purchase funnel, QA, QC, and with sunscreens, that's just how it is. But Gloria and I still appreciate that we have these channels so that we can access these kinds of products. Probably the one thing where the one channel that I don't love is Amazon. In the past, have purchased what feels like products that fell off the back of a truck kind of scenarios through Amazon. So I think that would be the one mode that has just not been my favorite in purchasing international products.
Yeah. I was going forward, because the de minimis rule is maybe dying, things are happening. Even buying from YesStyle and Stylevana, those pricing might go up and you might get hit with additional tax upon receipt. You might be tempted to turn to Amazon, which might still offer these products at very, very cheap. We would say just raise an eyebrow. I'll say Amazon for us, it's always a bit more of a gamble in terms of what you're getting. And I think the risk of counterfeit for these types of products in particular feels a little riskier.
Now, in terms of Chemist feels about the whole sunscreen landscape and the filters. We've actually been asked quite a few times how we feel about, general FDA regulation towards it. And it's pretty painful for us. I think ultimately we feel like the plight of a chemist in the US required to formulate sunscreens using US filters is very painful because we've done it ourselves. And honestly, in a way, doesn't get enough credit because of the challenges that we face with texture. I think the other challenge is also the road to formulating a unique sunscreen in the US that isn't just private labeled, a stock formula has a different label slapped on it. It's actually very long, it's costly, and it also doesn't help that claims testing to get these SPF UVA labels. There's definitely a much higher level of uncertainty than running your standard clinical. I feel like towards the FDA, and Gloria, I don't know, you can chime in, is the FDA is right to have a level of regulation around OTC products. That is for sure. The pain point is just Gloria and I will not be holding our breath for any new filter to come our way anytime soon. Because to be honest, we've been waiting since the start of our chemist career. So
yeah, I know there was a lot of buzz last year on news on the horizon that tinosorb S, or the chemical acronym is BMT, might be coming down the pipeline and might get approved any day now. Let's just say it's always been very dramatic with the FDA, and it seems like huge news that an application has even been put through, and it's very exciting with new developments, funding cuts, general turmoil. It just doesn't, I'm not sure if it's still going to really come this year or even the next. We're very unsure. And I do think there's a reason. I think a lot of people, consumers, will think all the regulations around the ingredient side, but there's textbooks and books and books and books on manufacturing practice, which is where actually a lot of these regulations come into play. And I will say FDA having their own standards there is one of the best things that they do for this issue, is trying to impose these manufacturing practices. Yes. You will be shocked what an unregulated in production site look like. I have seen those, and they are frightening.
The horror.
Yes. So anyway, that kind of sums up the first chunk, a big overview on some of the drama that you might have caught wind of. Hopefully this clarifies or at least highlights the state of affairs currently. Maybe by the time this episode comes out, there's some new development. And let us know if you have any questions, but we're going to take a quick break.
All right. We're going to take a quick break, and it's the Animal Fun Fact Corner. All right, Gloria. Today I have another beauty pageant for you.
I love beauty pageants.
All right. So I think last time we did a beauty pageant, it was about tarantulas.
Oh, yes.
Okay, we're back to farm animals, so...
Oh, no more critters.
No more critters. Not yet, anyways. So this is the Royal Cornwall. It's also in England. It's hosted every year in Wadebridge. This contest has been going on since 1793.
This contest is almost as old as the United States of America.
And so they said that originally when it started, it was a lot more like geared towards like agriculture, but now it's really moved into general livestock. And so it to me, it's just a very cute, wholesome fair. They say the founding principle has been to help the county's farmers improve through competition. Okay. And so I'm going to show a picture of what a typical judging scenario looks like. It's fascinating because all of the livestock handlers have to wear what looks like a lab coat. So it just looks like a bunch of scientists with their very good looking cows, just like doing the laps like a dog show. And what's really fascinating is that in terms of how they judge, let's say, for instance, a cow, I've come across lines in articles that talk about like, oh, a Hereford cow has his hair fluffed by a Hoover. Like, I'm just like, oh, I don't know what that means, but it sounds glamorous. And then when asked like what characteristics judges look for, they say, I'll read a quote here. It says, you should know every breed's characteristics and how good they represent that breed. But the first thing is mobility. There is a lot of cattle at this day and age that are more bothered about getting fancy weights. I think it's like pack on the size than they are about keeping the animal correct and mobile. Yeah. And I'll show some of the I'll show some of the winning animals up here. To be honest, they really look like textbook beautiful, like standard images of what a good looking like pig, for instance, or a cow looks like.
That is a handsome looking cow.
And so as you can see, some of them are massive. They really are. They also have things like the sheep shearing race, like how fast you can shear a sheep. And I think the other thing that's kind of cool about this competition is it's actually not for money. They say that the best sheep will win just 75 pounds and the best bull or cow only wins like 275 pounds. But the awards will help those farms in terms of advertising and being able to say they have like the best cows for breeding, or they even will sell like sperm of like the best cow or things like that. So it's like an opportunity for business.
Yeah, like I raised this handsome fellow. You can
won best in show.
That makes a lot of sense.
So with that, and I guess with the fame that these animals get, there are still cases of cheating. So apparently in one of the shows, I kind of laughed at this. They said one exhibitor was thrown out and stripped of her title after artificially coloring her sheep, which apparently they say is normal, but in this sense, it's not cool. And then they said 2 dairy cows at the Yorkshire show tested positive for performance-enhancing substances. And in the past, farmers have illegally glued the teats on udders to keep them swollen and full of milk. And I'm like, So anyways, if you happen to be in the city of Wadebridge in the first week of June this year, the show is going on. It might be fun for you to check out.
And let us know what it's like if you notice any glued udders. And
yeah, so that's it. That's the Royal Cornwall show.
Yay.
And judging beautiful cows.
Yay, those cows are very pretty.
They are. All right. Okay, so we should wrap this up, and we are going to be wrapping this up with some fun science around sunscreen that we thought is worthy of hearing about.
Yep, so that's enough of the heavy regulation stuff, but let's talk about any new studies we've noticed. And this first one we're going to share is kind of a fun survey study on a sentiment that we kind of felt last year testing a bunch of sunscreen, which is when a sunscreen is very expensive, do you use less of it? Because mentally you're like, oh my god, this is precious cargo. One of Victoria's old favorite mineral sunscreen is Murad City Defense, which last time we checked is something like $60 for
50 mils.
Yes. So when you use it, it's like especially when you feel the bottle getting lighter, do you consciously put a little bit less on just to hope it goes longer? Someone actually looked into it. This was a study based in San Francisco. There are 88 participants total who used 32 different brands of sunscreens, and the cost ranged from just 60 cents an ounce all the way up to $36.40 an ounce. Whoa. And the sun protection ranged from 30 to 100. I don't know who the 100 is, but that claim is not kosher.
Who are you?
Who are you? Shame. Anyway, and we'll just put the results up on the screen. It's kind of as we expected. I actually really like that they broke this down into arm and versus face application. And the data is presented as the percent of the recommended amount of sunscreen you apply. And the price at the bottom, you can see all the way at the left is the cheapest and all the way at the right is the most expensive. And we'll say this is pretty funny to me. In the very, very, very cheap side, we always on this podcast have been moaned that like most people are under applying sunscreen. More is more, more is more. But apparently, when things are really cheap, people apply to 200% of the recommended amount.
Yeah. And as predicted, as sunscreens got more expensive, there is a much higher chance of under applying. So, yeah, I mean, I'm really glad they did this study. I think it holds up with our theory.
Yep. So this is just kind of a funny chart to look at, and something to keep in mind as sunscreen prices rise is. This is still a category where protection, the amount of protection you get is very important, and more is more when it comes to applying sunscreen. So definitely choose a texture that you would slather on, but also choose a price point that you will slather on.
Yes, love that. The second study that we thought was fun to share and is really from left field happens to be a study where a lab wanted to see what would happen if you layered sunscreen first and then mosquito repellent on top. And the reason why I felt the need to share this study, despite the testing scenarios to be slightly different, is because it is very hard to find any sort of sunscreen layering study. So I really appreciate that this lab did this.
And it's always one of the top questions we get, which is, can I layer foundation over sunscreen? And for us, it's really hard to answer.
So hard.
And this study really addresses why.
Yeah. And so we'll try to give you the scenarios of how they did this study. So first, let's talk about the products. So they are testing, this study was done in France. And so the mosquito spray they were looking at is called Cinq sur Cinq Tropic. And they actually use a compound that is actually not that common in the US. It's called IR3535. And in this mosquito repellent spray, it is hydroalcoholic, so it's like mostly alcohol and water kind of formula. They use the Nivea sun cream that's with a SPF 50 This does use I believe, a tinazorb compound. They will also test a sink spray that also has an SPF 50 and uses these similar UV filters to the Nivea Sun. So bear with me. So that's 3 different types of products, all right? So what they're going to do is they're going to take ex vivo explant skin. That's skin taken from, usually from, a cosmetic surgery. They will take these slices of skin and they're going to apply these products and then zap it with some UV and see what happens. And so how they apply it is they're going to have one that's going to be just completely untreated skin. So that will be your control. The second will be your sunscreen only. The third will be mosquito spray only. And then your fourth will be sunscreen first, then mosquito spray on top as you're layering. And then finally, they're going to do just the combined product that has both mosquito repellent and sunscreen. All right. So I think that's 5, 6. I think I mentioned 6 scenarios, right? Including the control. After they treat them, they zap them with UV. They actually do 2 scenarios. In the first test they actually did UVB. Remember, UVB only. I didn't say UVA. And the second was just expose it to actual just sunlight. After they do the study, then they're going to take slides of the skin, stain it, and they're going to look at basically what's going to fluoresce under the microscope. And through the pigments, they do kind of an image analysis to calculate basically essentially the inflammation that occurs from the UV.
We'll put the image up on the slide. It's visually very obvious, the difference. So A is untreated. And without sun versus with sun, you'll notice right away that the image now has these really dark dots, dark purple dots on them. And along with that is a ring of like empty whiteness around it. And they say that by staining in this way, that darkening and that contracting of the nucleus and that kind of empty space is a telltale sign that the cell is at the beginning of its death stage. So essentially, that's how they measure UV damage.
Yeah. And if you look at the slides and you're like, I can't make heads or tails of this, not to worry, because they actually quantify it in a bar graph chart. If you look at the bar graphs, you can see that C is actually the set that was exposed to sunlight, and then D is the set that was exposed to UVB. And when I say UVB, you're wondering, it's a calculated dose that's giving this UVB radiation. These graphs are interesting because if you look at the sun one question you may have is, why does this sunscreen look like it's alone? This is just the sunscreen alone. Doesn't seem like it's doing anything in comparison. So despite this, there's a couple takeaways, and that is one question. The next question is, it looks like when you layer sunscreen and mosquito repellent, it's also not really doing anything. And then the combo spray, again, is another scenario where you're like, does it work? Does it not work? We're not really sure what's going on.
I think when I look at this, it really feels to me like, okay, the sun exposure, because it's not a controlled dose, the amount of sun, the amount of UV damage you're getting is all over the place. And it's just not right. Like the baseline is just not right.
So it actually has us asking a lot of questions. So thank God they probably had the same feelings. And they're like, you know what? Let's do one more test. They're going to stain it in a different way. But this time they are going to, the first set actually only came from one single transplant. And then they triplicated. So like basically took 3 different samples for each cell, basically. This time they're going to take it from 3 different transplants. They're going to have a bigger sample size. And this data I think makes me feel a little better about drawing a conclusion. The good thing is sunscreen seems to work. I should also mention in this study, they no longer used just regular sun exposure. This is just UVB, the calculated dose only.
They realized the sun is too variable, too unreliable, maybe. So they're like, we're going to shine a UV lamp.
Right, maybe. And so with that, you can see it looks like untreated skin and the site that only had sunscreen both seem to make sense, right? They don't see that level of fluorescence in the staining or that high contrast that's happening. However, again, you see that the layering of the two, the sunscreen and the mosquito repellent, seem to not be as effective. And the combo spray is actually really
also
concerning.
Not good.
Yeah. So what's the takeaway here? I think for us, we have to say that the combo spray is a very formula dependent scenario. And does that mean, I think for me, I feel like I'm not going to be relying on that particular formula for SPF benefits. The other thing is, I think the layering part is pretty fascinating because it's a water-based formula, or I should say water alcohol-based formula that's applied on top of the sunscreen. And so I think it kind of hints at the fact that as we were saying, when you apply a formula over your sunscreen, things can change and have an impact. Now, this study doesn't, I think Laura can agree that it doesn't actually indicate like all layer, like the degree of, I guess, degradation for all types of combinations, but it does kind of provide a little bit of insight on layering.
Yeah, I think that just shows that is a definite possibility that when you layer things after sunscreen, that film degrades, something happens, it might interact, so forth.
Yeah.
Now, this is one combination, one mosquito repellent that's hydroalcoholic base plus one very specific Nivea screen. Does that mean you're absolutely not okay to layer? No, but this highlights why we're hesitant to say, yeah, layer away, totally Gucci, layer then go into the sun. So all that to say is, this is part of the reason why when we talk about layering, we prefer sunscreen last.
Which is so hard for makeup users. We understand what we were asking.
Super hard. And when you apply makeup, we also recommend that the really oily, slippery type of formulas may not be the best combo because those have higher degree of chance of interacting and disrupting that sunscreen film. And again, very insightful, and unfortunately, we still don't have hard takeaways other than layering is generally kind of iffy.
Yeah. And I think one of the indicators for me is like a bad layering scenario is when you can feel your makeup sliding around.
Or any degree of pilling.
Yeah. Anything like that feels like they're just not set well.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, after allowing it to absorb and whatnot, I feel like are all pretty bad signs that I would try to find a different layering scenario.
And I think the final little takeaway is that there's a little Chemist shout out in there.
Yeah.
The combo spray looking a little sus in the UVB protection realm really highlights that sunscreen is not just about adding some filters into a cream, shaking it up and saying, good.
Again, DIYers, the people that DIY their sunscreens. Where does the confidence come from?
Victoria and I can tell you that even if you have a well-tested sunscreen ready to go, if you change one ingredient, you have to retest because it's finicky. It's one of those things that just needs a lot of due diligence around.
Is the truth.
Yeah. And that's it for that paper. And we're going to wrap this episode up with a little tidbit on something that you didn't think you're curious about, but yes, you are, which is, have you ever questioned what does the UV index actually mean?
Yeah, so everyone's smartphone now tells you what the UV index for the day is. And if you're ever wondering how you should interpret it, just know that it's the same thing. They actually want to determine your erythema dose for the day, just like they do in clinicals. The best resource to learn more about the UV index is going to the NOAA or the EPA sites. Their references are wonderful and they do a really great breakdown on how things are calculated. But ultimately in their models, they're looking at ozone data, they're looking at the forecasted cloud amounts, things like that to essentially calculate the erythema dose. Then after that, they have your actual elemental factors that contribute. And some of these things are things like elevation, which happens to increase your erythema dose by 6% per kilometer. Your general surface, so for example, if you have a snow-covered surface, that can increase your erythema dose by 30 to 100%. And also time of day, things like time of day, your cloud cover, land cover, latitude, all of these will factor into that number. Probably one of the things you'll see probably on social is when the UV index is 1 or 2, it's generally considered a pretty low exposure to UV, and therefore it's actually not necessary to wear sunscreen between the UV index of 1 to 2. But anything after that is when it becomes recommended. If you're curious, you can see how winter and summer can also impact. So what I found fascinating is a location like Phoenix, Arizona. In the winter, you can have a UV index of 3, and then in the summer, immediately jump to a UV index of 10.
I will say the UV index itself is pretty helpful, and I think I'm so glad that now it's like all on your phone because a lot of times people might see a cloudy day and perceive that as Gucci, but as Victoria just mentioned, there's so many factors that goes into it. For example, while we're recording it, it is very cloudy outside in LA right now, and when I went outside, I had a blip in my brain that's like, oh, I haven't put sunscreen on yet. Do I really need it? It's so cloudy. And I walked out, I was like, oh, it looks cloudy, but still feels a little sunny. And I just pulled up the UV index. It is 8. It is very high. Because it looks dim does not mean the UV exposure is low at all.
I'm actually so glad you bring this up because I think one of the questions around UV index has always been, well, what if it's cloudy? Like,
Yes.
doesn't that mean you're getting less sun? Well, actually, they've measured it, and there's actually a lot of conflicting data in this realm. But long story short, about up to 80% of our UV can penetrate cloud cover. So keep that in mind. And the second thing would also be that you might have one friend that will tell you that, oh, cloud cover actually can make UV stronger.
Mhm.
And this theory has been in question since 1964. I went down the rabbit hole, and I have learned that still to this day, they cannot quantify why this phenomenon happens.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't happen actually all the time. And so it turns out that when they take these cloud measurements, let me read you a line from one of the articles. It says, in more than a dozen studies since then, every data set includes at least some examples of what is known as cloud enhancement of UV. And then what they've seen is that measurements of UV at the Mauna Loa Observatory that's in Hawaii has as much as almost 30% above modeled clear sky levels.
30 is a lot higher than I thought.
Right.
I vaguely heard about this effect before. I did not go down the rabbit hole with Victoria.
I went too far, sorry.
If you asked me point blank to guess what that effect would be, I'll probably say like 10, 15%. 30 is really high.
Yeah, and the problem is they expect that, one thing to keep in mind is just they try to answer how common is cloud enhancement, right?
Uh-huh.
They say that various studies have found that between 1.4, which sounds low, and 8% of all measurements show cloud enhancement compared with clear sky values. They say it also depends on geographic location.
Mhm.
They said as many as 25% of those made on partly cloud days show cloud enhancement. And then on top of that, they actually say that this sort of like UV enhancement lasts for 10 minutes or less, which is not necessarily a concern for, they say, not necessarily a concern for sun worshipers, but has been known to persist for up to an hour. So again, it's a phenomenon that meteorologists know of, and like it's in the data, but it's so sporadic, and they still don't have a good understanding of why this happens. So yeah,
That is the
Clouds, man.
ultimate rolling of the dice.
right, exactly. So if you're ever wondering, should you wear sunscreen on a cloudy day, we would probably say check your UV index if you're really like, I really don't want to put on sunscreen, but ultimately it's still the best safe practice there.
Yeah. So I guess the takeaway from that is, Victoria, if the UV index is 2 today, would you put on sunscreen?
Okay, in LA, yes. Because LA, it's just constant sun, and I don't believe it. And I feel like it goes from what looks like very dark to very light very quickly. So
Mhm.
I think being in this city in particular, I'm going to be putting on every day, even if the UV index is 1. It's just like habit now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And before I so really interrupted Victoria's geographic talk by looking up the UV index, I was gonna say that's like kind of the other half of it is like, do you need sunscreen all the time during winter? Generally speaking, we'll say for like, you're probably not gonna get sunburn unless you're in a snow covered land.
If you're in Alaska, apparently your UV index on average in winter is less than 1. So probably not. It's probably dark.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be so geographic dependent. Whereas in Phoenix, your average is still a 3, which means on many, many days, it might still teeter into that 4, 5, even 6 range. So it's all geographic dependent. And I think in LA, like Victoria said, it's definitely one of those that even when it's dim, and you don't feel like that
Don't
sun is all,
believe.
yeah, it's a lie. It might clear up at any day. And there's always, for me, it's always like the temperature you feel as you walk.
Yeah.
It might be 58 outside and you walk for 5 minutes and you're like, this is kind of hot. And you realize the UV index is not as low as you think.
Yeah, so hopefully that helps you in determining, the UV index and what your phone's telling you daily, as kind of a guideline for like those days when you're like, I can't even put on sunscreen. Like, should you, let that be kind of a metric for you.
Mhm.
But otherwise, hopefully that is the end of our episode. And hopefully this is kind of a good intro into our sunscreen series coming up. We're a little bit out of order because what should follow is our 30 for 30 sunscreen.
Mhm.
But what we've got next is actually our vitamin C dupes
Yep.
study, our second round.
So let us know your vitamin C questions. If you have more questions about ascorbic acid,
Yeah.
any questions on derivatives. If you're like, oh my God, vitamin C again, talk about other antioxidants. Put in your request below too. We'll get to it after sunscreens.
Ugh.
Oh, peace. Hey guys, it's been 24 hours since we recorded this episode, and we've been seeing more sentiments come up online, and we just realized that there is something we really have to address here.
Yeah, so while, along with this episode, we had mentioned that material in beauty is going to get more expensive. That sentiment has been shared online, which has led to the act of a lot of panic buying and panic bulk buying. So we just want to remind everyone of sunscreen shelf life. That is probably going to be the most important claim on the label that is going to ensure that you're getting the right amount of protection to protect your skin from damaging UV rays.
Yes, most sunscreen products that you see on the market should have their shelf life and expiration date pretty clearly marked. So this is something to keep in mind as you're stockpiling. Make sure you don't over stockpile, and that is a very important aspect. We have shared before on this podcast and on our social sunscreen that just look a little sus even before the expiration date.
Yeah.
But even sunscreen that's past expiration date that looks normal does not mean that same level of protection is still there. So definitely important to keep in mind.
Yeah. So as you are purchasing for this year and the next year's worth of sunscreen makes sense, but maybe purchasing for a full presidential term worth of sunscreen makes a lot less sense. And one tip for you guys is we actually always Sharpie the expiration date onto any of our sunscreens. So maybe you guys can give that a try. But otherwise, yeah, just keep that in mind. As you can see, the sentiment around sunscreens is fluctuating pretty much every day. And if you want to keep tabs on it, just check out our shorts and our social, and that'll be the quickest way that we can give you guys the most accurate in the moment update on this topic.
And that's it. We'll see you guys all next week. Hopefully we don't have to record another update tomorrow. And we'll see you on the podcast.
Bye, guys. All right, guys, we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.